I caught my 16 years house help making love to my 7 years old son in their room. And my husband told me to leave her, and my husband does not want me to send her away. In a nearby neighboring village, not far away from Enugu State, there lived a family of Mr. and Mrs. Philip. Mrs. Philip brought in a house help named Norma, whom she brought from the village when she was 8 years old. She has been a good girl who respects and loves Miss Philip's children. The way she looks after Mrs. Philip's children made her to fall in love with Norma. Mrs. Philip took her as a daughter she don't have. Mrs. Philip moved Norma to private school where Mrs. Philip's children were attending. Mr. and Mrs. Philip usually share days of school runs, and they also go back during her own time of closure to bring her home. You can never believe that Norma is not Mr. and Mrs. Philip's daughter. So on Saturday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Philip have all gone to bed. Then later the day, Mr. Philip went on a business trip, so he didn't come back that night. Mrs. Philip was alone with Kate and Norma, the house help. That Saturday night, they have all gone to bed, and Norma shares room with Mrs. Philip's children. As Mrs. Philip was sleeping, her last boy of 4 years cried into Mrs. Philip's room. He said, "Auntie Norma and Bobo chased me out," and Mrs. Philip was not okay with that. And immediately Mrs. Philip went to their room. They said he is disturbing them, that they are trying to read their books. And Mrs. Philip said, "Okay," because she don't want to disturb or distract them from reading their books. And she took her last baby into her room, but her spirit was not comfortable. So after 1 hour, Mrs. Philip was pushed to go and check them again. So as she got there, Norma was on top of Mrs. Philip's son, and she shouted. And she came down and was begging Mrs. Philip. Mrs. Philip called her husband that night immediately, and she told him that before he returns, that she will send Norma back because she wouldn't want that to continue. Mr. Philip told her wife to allow him come home first, and Mrs. Philip obeyed him. And the next day, Mr. Philip came in and told his wife to forgive her. "What if she's your own daughter? Will you push her away?" Mr. Philip asked his wife. Mr. Philip was very angry in her spirit. Mrs. Philip was very angry in her spirit, and they called their son, and he started crying. "Mommy, I am sorry. It was Auntie Norma that told me to lay down. If not, she would tell you that I insulted her." Mrs. Philip asked her son if it has happened before, and he said no, that it just happened that night. And Mr. Philip told his wife to allow him go. Mrs. Philip's son left, and Mrs. Philip's son left, and Mrs. Philip told her husband that Norma must go, and Mr. Philip said no, she won't go. After 2 days, Mr. Philip went to pick Norma from school because it was her turn to pick her, and Mrs. Philip didn't take her home straight. She took her to a cool garden where they usually go for relaxation during their holiday, because she has been bitter over her reactions. Then, then Mrs. Philip asked Norma, her house help, why did she do that to her son? In Mrs. Philip's voice, "Since you came to my house, have I done you any wrong? Why do you want to spoil my own child?" Mrs. Philip was crying and said, "I have treated you like my own child, and you've been a good child. I've promised myself to train you in the university, but what did you do but where did you do this to me?" And immediately Norma started crying. "Mommy, I am sorry." Yes, she calls Mrs. Philip mommy, and Norma continued, pleading for forgiveness and said, "Mommy, please forgive me. It was daddy that taught me. Since I started living with you, When I was 8 years, Daddy is always using his hands inside me, and he's so much shocked. And in so much shock, Mrs. Philip asked, "Which daddy?" "Your husband, of course," Norma replied. "When I turned 14 years, he started making love to me every night. There is no night he does not come to our room to sleep with me, except that night he traveled. And my body was shaking and wanting it. I tried to sleep, but it could not stop. Then I told Bobo to lay down. If not, I will report him to you that he insulted me." Norma, Mrs. Philip Housepeck continued and said that sometimes when Daddy used to bring me from school, he takes me to Uncle John's house where two of them will sleep with her, one after the other. Jesus! Mrs. Philip shouted in shock and said, "Why haven't you told me all this in a while?" And